of the components of trauma, no one symptom means a person is traumatized. Mm-hmm. We generally look at their work environment, and if they've been exposed to traumatized people, and then we might be able to guess that, you know what, they're exposed to it. We give some education, and people can often self-identify, yeah, I'm traumatized.
I understand that one of the groups you've worked with is journalists, because
Yes.
journalists covering horrific disasters or crimes are witnessing some things that are very, very difficult. So can you tell us a little bit more about that work?
Yeah, journalists are a community of people that are taught to remain relatively removed from their subject. Mm-hmm. Now that's the old teaching. There's newer schools of journalism which teach people to get more involved with the people that they're working with or the suffering they're working with. But we know that journalists tell us so often about the bad news in our world. Mm-hmm. And a journalist has to remain kind of composed, has to ask questions, be interested in the story, but in the meanwhile, not necessarily aware of the impact it's having on their own self. And that's the empathy part, the vicarious part, that journalists are our conduit. They're our channel for bad news oftentimes, but they don't get to necessarily have their own feelings. And their media agencies often don't recognize that people are affected by the stories they tell.
I'm also interested, Dr. Shan, how our community, our South Asian community here in the U.S. could be more involved, to learn more about integrative medicine, to be more proactive around mental health, and be aware of things like vicarious stress, like you said, and burnout. What are some ways that we can expand our own knowledge about this?
Well, so there's personal, interpersonal ways, and there's institutional ways. Let me talk about the first, the personal ways. The personal ways are that we as a community often are not good listeners. Mm-hmm. And I think we're getting better by becoming interested in the psychological realm. But there's a lot of advice giving in our community.
True.
There's a lot of not putting oneself in somebody else's shoes and instead saying, well, if I were going through that, this is exactly what I would do. So what I would say, one, is to step back and to listen, that communication is so important. Emotional distress and mental illness thrive in silence. They get worse in silence. And there's also a way to be silent even while you're talking, which is that we do a lot of unproductive communication. We all know how to talk a lot without saying anything.
Yeah.
So when somebody seems to be in emotional distress, the first job is to listen, to find out what it's like to be in their shoes. And that is very difficult. It's often really scary because emotional and mental distress frightens everybody. It doesn't have to be only our community. It frightens us because the very way that we experience the world, our mind, is being affected. And to be able to deal with that, we need to be able to develop a certain degree of courage. Mm-hmm. And understand that if we take a step to talking to somebody who looks like they're in trouble, that there's a massive opportunity. Actually, the growth of intimacy and the growth of a relationship can be substantial if one is able to talk and to sit with emotional pain. Mm-hmm. But that's often the thing that keeps people from actually broaching the subject. You know what? Getting into emotional pain, it's very frightening.
It's much
and painful.
easier to sort of avoid that, it seems.
It is. It is.
What are the institutional things we should be aware of?
Institutionally, we can get involved with organizations that really look to promoting the welfare of our communities. I'm part of an organization that's a professional organization called South Asian Mental Health Association, and we're a bunch of mental health practitioners from different backgrounds, different schoolings, and we talk about best practices. How can we best understand the particular forms of suffering that happen in the South Asian community? Mm-hmm. We don't provide services, we don't provide referrals to the general public, but then there's another organization that does, CHAI. CHAI is counselors helping South Asian Indians. And that organization provides education, referrals, wellness programs to the general public. CHAI, in fact, has a very good banquet coming up in which people can get more involved with the mental health, emotional health of our community. The banquet is on November 6th. It's a luncheon, and actually I'll be introducing their key guest, Ethan Waters, who is a writer of a book called Crazy Like Us. Really fascinating book in which he discusses the ways in which people do not suffer the same around the world. Depression looks different. He even asked the question, is depression even the same thing in China, Sri Lanka, and the United States? November 7th, I'm going to be leading the American Group Psychotherapy Association in a conversation about the negative impact of Islamophobia and how specifically people and communities are changing the way they live because of the fear of being thought of as Muslim. This also certainly affects many non-Muslims. Sikhs particularly are very vulnerable, but anybody who's brown-skinned, anybody who's going to be believed to be Muslim is vulnerable to their neighbors who potentially think that any Muslim is somehow a threat to this country. And the amount of suffering this causes is significant. On a day-to-day basis, children are bullied on this basis. Women are intimidated. Men change their routes of where they walk. Yeah. This is not to be underestimated, and I think it's a really important way that we can promote the mental health of our community by finding ways to reduce the impact of Islamophobia on us.
Great. Well, Dr. Shah, I very much enjoyed our conversation. You're doing some wonderful work in our community and expanding that outside of that as well. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us.
It's a pleasure. I love what I get to do.
Great. Thanks.